mean, Ian's an extremely hardworking, prolific publisher of materials on an enormous range of topics, many of which I imagine will come into the discussion tonight. I mean, I knew him initially through his work on Paul Feyerabend in philosophy of science, but he also covers areas like aesthetics, epistemology, philosophy of religion, Buddhism, Confucianism, virtues and vices. And when I was in contact with him recently, he mentioned a nascent interest in philosophical misanthropy. So I thought that that would be a great topic to discuss tonight. So thanks for joining me, Ian. Thanks for joining us. And I think we'll just kick it off with a very simple question. What was it that kind of got you into this topic? What was it that motivated this new direction in your research?
Well, in a sense, misanthropy is not an easy topic to get into because the subject is, of course, intrinsically negative. I think about misanthropy as systematic condemnation of the moral character of humankind. Crudely, that humankind as it's come to be is just morally atrocious. And for all sorts of philosophical and psychological reasons, that's not an attractive thesis for many people. And certainly I'm not temperamentally misanthropic. But my contact with this subject really was through the work of my Durham colleague, David Cooper. He recently wrote a book called Animals and Misanthropy. And David's thesis in this book is that honest reflection on the exploitation and abuse of animals by humankind justifies a charge of misanthropy. And I'd never encountered before that misanthropy as a serious philosophical doctrine. I imagine, like most people, I was, of course, familiar with misanthropy as a general concept or idea, but it's never been one that philosophers have really taken seriously. So you'll find, for example, moral philosophers who will describe themselves as realists or sentimentalists or contractarians or utilitarians, but never as misanthropes. And what was very interesting about David's claim in Animals and Misanthropy was first that he was talking philosophically about misanthropy, and I'm always attracted to new ideas, but also that he made an extremely compelling case that reflection on how we treat animals as a culture, as a way of life, does justify a misanthropic charge. So it's partly the novelty of the idea and partly the force of the arguments.
Okay, I mean, I guess I think in common parlance, misanthropy kind of means one thing pretty much. It means a kind of a hatred, or at the very least a dislike of all humans or humanity, or possibly even extending towards life itself. I mean, what is the kind of, if you like, affective economy of misanthropy? Is hatred or strong dislike the primary affect that drives the misanthrope?
Well, if you consult the very, very few philosophical discussions of misanthropy, they follow the dictionary definition in characterizing misanthropy as hatred. So the OED says that a misanthrope is someone who hates human beings or hates humanity. And philosophers like Judith Shklar, who do talk about misanthropy, they tend to follow that definition pretty closely. But when I began to look into the topic of misanthropy and look at some candidate philosophical misanthropes, it seemed to me that characterizing it as hatred is simply too narrow, I suppose, for two reasons. One is that it's simply too crude to characterize something as complex as a human being's attitude towards humanity with a single emotion like hatred. I mean, nobody's inner life is so simple that it's exhaustively characterized by one emotion, even a very strong one like hatred. And second, it seemed that when you actually looked at the attitudes of particular philosophical misanthropes, it was clear that there was a whole, in your nice phrase, whole economy of attitudes. So one of my candidate philosophical misanthropes is Confucius. Now, if you read through his writings, there's a clear moral condemnation of humankind for its entrenched greediness, laziness, treacherousness, moral indifference, arrogance, dogmatism. But when you look at how Confucius as a philosopher and a human being responds to this, he has a whole range of complex responses. There are moments of frustration and despair, and then there are surges of optimism where he thinks we really could turn it around for the better. Then there are moments of quietistic despair. And I think that's really what's characteristic of the misanthrope. Some forms might be characterized by a strong hatred, but in practice, it's much more complex than that. And I think part of the difficulty of being a philosophical misanthrope is not coping with a constant diet of hatred. It's rather trying to cope with this constant oscillation between frustration, optimism, despair, resignation, pessimism, gloom. That's the real economy of misanthropy. Hatred is too narrow.
I mean, obviously you're trying to sort of expand the remit of the concept beyond the narrow definition you mentioned, but why would you want to do this? I mean, obviously it has a negative feel to it, and so the sense would be, why would you want to kind of expand it into broader spheres of human life? What's the motivation?
Well, I think one common argument given by misanthropes is that, depressing as it might seem, misanthropy does register a fundamental truth about humankind as it's come to be, a truth which is so central to humanity that you really have to face it if you want to do any serious work in moral philosophy, but also if you want to make any serious practical efforts to change humanity. So Schopenhauer, for instance, was a philosophical misanthrope, and we have this from his own lips. But for Schopenhauer, what's really important about misanthropy is that it gives us a very sober perspective on the sheer scale of the moral challenges facing us. So Schopenhauer was perfectly aware that there are good reasons to want to have a rosier, more optimistic vision of humankind. But he says at the same time, it really is a refusal to acknowledge the sheer scale of our moral failings. And as with many areas of life, if you're not honest about the scale and extent of the problems, how could you ever hope to do something about them? And I think that spirit runs through many philosophical misanthropes. They're usually pretty careful about how loudly they broadcast their misanthropy and to whom, but still the claim is that this is a deep fact about humankind. We are systematically and, if you like, institutionally, morally appalling. And if we turn away from that fact and indulge in facile optimism or naive sentimentalization, we're just going to remain in this state forever. So there's partly the elitic argument based on truth, but also this ameliorative spirit. Unless you actually acknowledge the scale of the moral problems that face you, however are you going to deal with them?
So I guess an extended question that comes out of that would be, at what level of analysis does philosophical misanthropy operate? Because I'm guessing it's not going to be at the level of the individual human. I mean, if you're hateful of all individual humans, that strikes me as a vice rather than something that could have any redeeming qualities. I mean, it could be just basic bad fortune in your life, but nonetheless, it's not something that philosophers would want to encourage. I mean, would it be at the level of, say, human nature, understood in terms of evolution and biology, or would it be at the level of culture? I mean, where do you operate in your analysis of the concept?
Well, I think it's certainly correct that misanthropy is not an evaluation of individual human beings. Partly because that would simply be absurd. I mean, I've met a lot of human beings, but I haven't met all of you. And it would be silly to say that the misanthrope is making an informed judgment about every individual. In fact, Jonathan Swift, a very misanthropic writer, he has a nice remark that he likes, as it were, Tom, Dick, and Harry. He said, it's really humankind I like, but certain individuals are fine. I mean, for a misanthrope, one reason that you would like certain individuals is that some people are admirably free of the vices and failings that characterize the rest of us. I think that's why it's very interesting that many philosophical misanthropes like Montaigne, they really cling close to friendship as the last and final guard against total misanthropy. So, Montaigne was very misanthropic and thought that humankind was just systematically susceptible to hypocrisy, narrow-mindedness, and laziness. But he says, my closest friend, La Boete, he says, he really is a true person because he's free of those failings. So it's not a judgment on individuals, even if some individuals will always serve as being particularly exemplary of our moral failings. So the obvious example in 2020 is, of course, someone like Donald Trump. Now, it's interesting that when you look at media coverage of Trump, people often say that he is just a symbol of all that's wrong with America or with the patriarchy or with humankind, because in his figure, you see manifested in their most extreme forms the arrogance, the vanity, the narcissism, and the cruelty of humankind, distilled in perfect form. So the misanthrope's not judging individuals, even though they will sometimes point to certain individuals as exemplars of our failings. Then if you ask then, well, if not individuals, what is the target? You get two sorts of answers, really. So there are some misanthropes who are judging human nature. And for them, what's really corrupt and vicious is our underlying nature. Whether you want to tell an evolutionary story about our evolved nature, the sort that Richard Dawkins used to peddle, that, you know, as a consequence of our evolutionary history, we are just intrinsically vicious, violent, and selfish. Or if you want to tell theological stories. So for St. Augustine, human nature is corrupted by original sin. And that's something that can only be overcome through divine grace. Problem is, though, that not all misanthropes think you need to tell any story at all about human nature. So Rousseau is a good example. I mean, for Rousseau, what's really corrupting is the influences of collectivized, civilized life. Our underlying nature, he says, is kind of beside the point. It's not natural man, as we used to be. It's really civilized man. And for Rousseau, there's a very complex story to tell about the corrupting effects of private property, social hierarchies, and stratification. And my own view really follows that of David Cooper. So he says the misanthrope can remain entirely silent about human nature. You don't have to make any suppositions at all about what we used to be way back when in the Pleistocene, or what we are deep down. Because what the misanthrope is condemning is humankind as it's come to be, the particular contingent ways we have of organizing and arranging our lives, the ambitions, the imperatives that we share as a culture. That's the problem. You don't need to go anthropological at all. And I think that's a sensible view for all sorts of reasons. I mean, for one thing, it means that we don't have to engage in the trouble of engaging in anthropology and evolutionary sciences. And it means that we can motivate misanthropy just by looking at what we've come to be, quite independently of whatever we used to be or might be deep down.
Yeah, I mean, I guess with looking at it at the level of, I suppose you may call it humankind, also brings agency into it. Because I saw a quote from David Benatar, who I guess is a contemporary misanthrope with a capital M, and he writes, the human predicament is fundamentally and overwhelmingly not the product of any agent. It is the product of blind evolutionary forces that are indifferent to us. So I guess when you look at it from that angle, it's a little bit too abstract to really talk of virtues and vices. It seems like we're sort of puppets at the whim of a much greater force. Whereas I guess if you're looking at it at the level of day-to-day actions, it brings in agency. So is that kind of a central presupposition of your model, that humans are agents with the capacity to act, independent of what you may call indifferent evolutionary forces?
Well, I think this is where it's useful to go looking in the history of philosophy for particular misanthropes, because in my experience, misanthropes always have a story to tell about how we came to be this way. So Rousseau tells a story about the development of social organization and practices like private property and how they corrupted us. Augustine has a story to tell about original sin and how basically, thanks to that bloody snake, it's all been ruined ever since. But for other misanthropes, there are different stories to tell. So for many Buddhists, for instance, our contemporary corruption is a product of irresistible historical forces. We are moving into what the Buddhists call Antarakapa, the age of swords, and this just will be a period of increasing violence and corruption. And this is just an irresistible historical process. For others, they appeal to fate or the caprice of the gods. And other misanthropes will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, there's no outside force like God or fate that have led to us developing in these appalling ways. It was just historical contingency. It was just bad luck. And some misanthropes want to tell these large, complex stories. Others feel obliged to because they have background doctrinal commitment. So Christian misanthropes, of course, have to tell a story about how he came to be this way. So you have no shortage of options. But I think which stories you can take seriously will depend a lot upon your culture and your form of life. So I take it that Augustine's appeals to the doctrine of original sin, that was very intelligible and compelling for people back in the Christian medieval period. maybe in a way that it's not these days, when appeals to our evolutionary history might be more compelling. And this is a case where the philosophical misanthrope really does need to do some philosophy and start to assess broader worldviews and conceptions of human life, and if you like, questions of cosmology and the nature of reality itself. And that's partly why it's an interesting topic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I imagine it would be difficult to sort of fully separate them, but where does pessimism kind of overlap or separate from misanthropy? Because I guess someone like Schopenhauer was both a pessimist and a misanthrope. And people may tend to sort of elide the two quite easily. So where would you see the important distinctions between those two, say, attitudes towards life? Or...
Well, they are usually conflated. In fact, in a very recent book on pessimism by Joshua Dienstag, he says, we have no other word for the condemnation of human existence and life than pessimism. But I think the problem is that he's not drawing a distinction there between two different things. So the pessimist and the misanthrope, they both agree that human existence is, in a very deep sense, awful. But their focus differs. So for the pessimist, what's awful are certain deep features of human existence that deny us the possibility of happiness or flourishing, whether that's boredom or suffering or the cosmic will for Schopenhauer. Whereas for the pessimist, the focus is very different. It is on human vices and failings, our moral corruptions. So they agree that our existence is awful, but the focus is quite different. So you could think that human existence is fundamentally one of suffering and craving driven by a cosmic will, without also telling a story about our moral corruptions. It just so happens that for Schopenhauer, you need both to tell a full story. So the focus is different. They both agree that human existence is awful, but for the pessimist, the causes of this awfulness are not us. It's deeper features of the nature of reality. Whereas the misanthrope focuses upon aspects of our awfulness that are, in a broad sense, our responsibility. Our vices, failings, corruptions, perversions.
Okay, I mean, one of the I suppose most famous, relatively recent works of philosophical misanthropy was Straw Dogs by John Gray, and in that he came up with the phrase Homo rapiens, kind of implying that we are kind of rapacious, greedy, destructive. But Rutger Bregman, the Dutch historian, wrote a book, which was published probably in June or something, called Humankind, and in it, as I understand, he calls humans Homo puppy, suggesting that we are kind of cuddly and lovable. I mean, you've reviewed Bregman's book, so what is your kind of sense of his project, and how does it fit in with your analysis?
Well, he's now written two books developing this doctrine of optimism. So the first was called Utopia for Realists, and it does what it says on the tin. And in this book, Humankind, he makes this very broad argument that if you look at our evolutionary history, if you go through archaeology and paleontology, you discover that human beings are fundamentally evolved to be, in his phrase, Homo puppies, fundamentally gentle, friendly, playful, cooperative, attuned to one another's needs and interests, just like puppies. And Bregman wants to use this to motivate a very optimistic vision of our current moral performance and our moral possibilities going into the future. So he's urging a strong optimism that because human beings are fundamentally disposed to cooperativeness, playfulness, and puppyish virtues, we're going to be all right into the future. He does emphasize that, there is a need for a little bit of work. So he's very open about his socialism. He says we need universal basic income, we need to tax the rich, we need universal education. And that vision that he has of human beings is very, very attractive. So his book, Humankind, was very popular. It sold out before it was published. The problems with it, though, well, I think there are several problems with it. So one is that his claims are, I think, fundamentally besides the point, because what we are like deep down, or what we were like 500,000 years ago, is actually irrelevant to an assessment of our contemporary condition. So human beings might, by evolutionary nature, be disposed towards cooperative and friendliness. But the question is, well, how do the contemporary structures of human life enable these dispositions to manifest? So a very odd feature of his book is that he often sounds like a misanthrope. So Bregman will often talk about the violence, the competitiveness, the jealousy, the envy, the violence, the dogmatism of human life, but then says, but don't worry, because deep down we're really puppies. To which the obvious response is, well, deep down we might be puppies, but in our overt behavior in our social communities, we are wolves. And the reason is that many features of our societies encourage us to be wolves. They encourage us to be aggressive, competitive, and rapacious. Just one example from his book, he documents some very interesting data from military historians, which indicate that in the majority of battles and over the last 200 years, soldiers are extremely reluctant to actually shoot at their opponents, at their enemies. So what you find is that the guns are usually either fired upwards or they're not fired at all. So in one of the big battles of the US Civil War, it was found that something like 65% of the soldiers hadn't fired a shot. And Bregman draws from this very optimistic conclusion that our resistance to killing our fellows is so strong that this confirms the Homo puppy story. But what he doesn't mention is that the history of human military technology is really aimed at helping people to overcome this resistance. For instance, by developing range weapons like bows and rifles, by using dehumanization techniques to present the enemy as violent or corrupt or as insects or vermin, right through to the development of drone technology, where you don't have to be on the same continent as the people you kill. And I think that's an indication where facts about our underlying nature are really irrelevant. The question to ask is, how can human beings live and behave within contemporary conditions? That's the question to ask. So I think that's one problem with his book. It might be cheerful to indicate all these moral facts about our puppyish natures, but it's not our underlying nature that matters. It's our contemporary behavior as it's structured by our wider world. And then a second, more general problem is that many of the claims that he makes to encourage optimism are simply just too blasé. For instance, one that caught my eye, he assures us at one point, slavery was abolished, therefore Homo puppy is winning. But of course he ignores the 50 million human beings who the UN estimates to be enslaved in the world right now. He doesn't mention the 150 million child workers whose conditions are practically indistinguishable from slavery. And so there are these strategic omissions where he encourages optimism through blandness. And so although I'm attracted to the optimism of the book, empirically and argumentatively, it's not borne out at all. He only achieves this optimism by playing down relevant facts about the world, or by encouraging us to think that change is just around the corner. And one of the main faults is that although he professes to be a socialist, he consistently ignores all the structural constraints on human beings. And for that reason, I think he's a sort of dogmatic optimist. He's not attending to the actual facts about human beings, partly because that's depressing and it waters down the optimism, but it does give us a truer picture of what we're actually like.
I mean, obviously the pandemic is an excellent way to assess some of the kinds of arguments that someone like Bregman would offer. And there have been a lot of, positive moments, like Captain Sir Tom Moore, who's occupied the last two front covers of the Radio Times, for example, has obviously been a big story about the goodness of humanity. But I found two quotes, one of which by Lily Cole, who is a campaigner and an activist on the pandemic. And she said, the charged beauty of this moment is that almost anything is possible. So another quote from the French novelist Michel Houellebecq says, I do not believe for half a second the declarations that nothing will be like it was before. We will not wake up after lockdown in a new world. It will be the same, just a bit worse. And I guess what was interesting about it for me is that Lily Cole often kind of offers semi-misanthropic sentiments. For example, at one point she says, what's the worst case scenario? Just that we're going to wipe ourselves out along with other species, but the world will no doubt bounce back and there might even be more interesting creatures that emerge instead of us. So there's a misanthropic strain, but a fundamental belief in, say, the COVID pandemic as being a vehicle for potentially anything being possible. And then Houellebecq, I guess, offers what you might call the capital M misanthropic view, which is largely that, let's not kid ourselves, nothing is really going to change. So, I mean, would you say that they both count as misanthropes? And if so, what are the kind of differences between them?
Well, a person can have misanthropic attitudes and moods without being a full-blooded card-carrying misanthrope. I mean, I think Schopenhauer is right when he says that people become misanthropes through long, sad experience of the world. He says if you have enough of these depressing experiences, it does cultivate a certain mood in people. And if that mood develops, it eventually forms itself into a doctrine of misanthropy. And I take it that many people are really fighting against the tendencies of a misanthropic mood. Maybe they fall into a glum despair at the fact that, things never change for the better, or that change is so slow. They realize that progress is hard won, but easily undone. And for these reasons, people feel the pull of a misanthropy and then pull themselves back with more optimistic, bright-siding stories. I mean, in the case of the pandemic, there was lots of that moral rhetoric of a forthcoming moral renaissance that, finally we will realize the importance of neighborliness, of compassion, of pulling together. Now, I'm skeptical about a lot of that sort of moral rhetoric, partly because I think it's rarely the case that even dramatic events bring about this sort of fundamental moral change, and partly because we've often heard this sort of story before. For instance, you can take any series of catastrophic events in human history, even quite recently, and the constant refrain from many people is never again, never again, never again. So, for example, it was 5 years ago that the young body of Alan Kurdi washed up on a Mediterranean beach. The image of a young child dead face down in the ocean was appalling. And even anti-immigrant newspapers like the Daily Mail said this is appalling, it must never happen again. And yet you read those same newspapers right now, and the rhetoric is we should send in the Royal Navy and turn these people away. And I think a misanthrope then is, they're not exulting in their pessimism. They're simply offering what they regard as a sober realization that human beings have powerfully entrenched moral failings like complacency, self-interest, desire for a quiet life, indifference to others. And it takes enormous force to either suppress or overcome those failings. And in many cases, I think what you might need is systematic, structural, moral change. And you just don't see that in many of these cases. So I'm sure that many people genuinely enjoyed the sense of neighborliness during the pandemic, and they did, for the first time, maybe chat over the fence to their neighbors, pull together, and so on. But I think as soon as people feel safe again in their homes and can once again go out in the world, many of those things will fall away, because there is a sort of pragmatic pessimism built into a lot of moral philosophy that if you really want to create positive changes that last, you have to fundamentally change people's habits and the structures of their life. But that's enormous hard work.
I mean, surely the if you like, the full-blooded misanthrope would sort of question the very possibility of that. I mean, it's generally their kind of intransigent belief in non-progress that kind of characterizes, say, John Gray, Michel Houellebecq. So in a way, it seems that I suppose, capital M misanthrope is largely defined by their approach to action. They may either choose to kind of sneer at kind of popular sentiments, or they may choose a form of quietism. But either way, they'd be extremely suspicious of any large-scale action. So it seems to me that that's kind of the core question, is related to action in the world. The misanthrope, the full-blooded misanthrope, would see it as either downright dangerous or at least worthy of considerable skepticism. I mean, what do you see as the consequences of misanthropy in terms of action in the world?
Well, one thing I think is vital about misanthropy is that there are different ways to be a misanthrope. There are different misanthropic stances, as I would call them. So the one that everyone thinks of is what Kant calls the enemy, the misanthrope who's dominated by hatred or frustration, and their practical response is violence. They try to tear down the human world, to unmake civilization. This is very popular rhetoric amongst some eco-misanthropes. They want to do violence to the human world, to tear it all down, to disrupt the system. And the violence might be physical or it might be symbolic. But that's one way to be a misanthrope, the enemy. But Kant says there's also a second misanthropic stance, the one he calls the fugitive from mankind. He says their dominant emotions are fear and anxiety. They fear the violence human beings do, they fear being corrupted, and their response is not violence, but flight. They pull away from the human world. They try to retreat into monasteries or secluded locations. Or, of course, in the case of Buddhism, they try to escape from human existence itself by breaking out of the cycle of rebirth. So already that's two stances, the enemy and the fugitive. But I think you can also find at least two more. So someone like Confucius is what I would call an activist misanthrope. He thinks that humankind as it's come to be is morally appalling, but there are grounds for hope. There are things that can be done. And for Confucius, that involves moral teaching, trying to inveigh with rulers, initiating social reforms, and getting out there, rolling up your sleeves and trying to do things. So that's the third type of misanthrope. And then the other common one is the quietist, the misanthrope who thinks human being is collectively morally appalling. There's really very little that could be done to collectively transform this. So the best you can do is to live quietistically. Keep your head down, try to preserve your own moral character, perform small local acts of care and compassion, but otherwise abandon these large-scale hopes.
So what kind of skeptical response might the quietist have to, say, the activist misanthrope? What would their reasons be for kind of being skeptical about their action, given that there is obviously a history of successful actions that have improved the human lot?
Well, different quietist misanthropes will give different reasons. So there's a certain strain of argument that owes to conservative political philosophy, which suggests that because the societies that we live in are organically developed over many, many generations, they weren't the products of systematic planning, there's always an enormous inherent risk that if you try to initiate large-scale changes that are rapid and radical, the backfire risks are just too severe. You might think that making these radical changes will do things for the best, but how do you know that? Because no one has an overall view of the structure and operations of our higgledy-piggledy social world. There's a precautionary principle. Keep the changes small, modest, and local, because the backfire risks can be too extreme. Other quietists fear that grand reform efforts will actually supercharge our vices. And again, this is a strain of argument you see in some conservative political philosophers, but also in others too. So the Buddha worries that large-scale attempts to reshape society on a grand scale will tend to feed our arrogance, our hubris, our vainglory. And there's also a further style of argument, again put about by the Buddhists, which is that there's a strong tension between the assertive ambitiousness of activistic reform and the virtues we ought to be cultivating, like quietude, equanimity, tranquility. So different quietists give you different reasons, but their collective concern is that there are severe practical and moral risks in large-scale collective activism. Best to keep things small, simple, and modest.
Okay, so I think we'll end with a couple of more general questions. So one which I'd noted is that we often say, almost as if it's obviously true, that we ask ourselves, what will future generations judge us for? And obviously the assumption of that is that future generations will be better, more enlightened people than us. What do you make of that kind of stance towards the future?
Well, I think one important comment on that sort of future-directed optimism is that, at least in the West, that's quite a historically recent attitude. So I think really that starts to become prominent and plausible, really, with the French Enlightenment. The confidence of Diderot, d'Alembert, and Voltaire, that once you clear away all those, old-style religious superstitions and the monarchical system, that will liberate human beings' creative energies, and in the future we can be confident of betterment. And of course, that was accelerated in the 19th century by Comte and the prophets of science, who thought into the future we can be confident of human moral progress. But outside of that, you don't really find that sort of strong confidence that we're going to be better. Now, I think that the belief in the improvability of humankind is important, partly because otherwise there can be an element of a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's nothing we can do to get better, so we shouldn't do anything. We remain as we are. However, I think there are also big dangers in any lazy confidence that this is inevitable, that we just have to, as it were, sit back and wait out. because I think that as a general rule, moral progress takes a vast amount of effort to make it possible, to realize it in practice, and then to keep it in place. Because there does seem to be some perverse law of social mechanics that moral progress takes a vast amount of energy to achieve, but very, very little energy to undo. So consider the fact that 100 years ago, it would have been inconceivable to many, many people that National Socialism would ever return, well, maybe 8 years ago, would never, ever, ever return to human societies. Whereas now, of course, we have open National Socialists and resurgent neo-Nazis in Europe and the United States. And I think that's a good example of the fact that we should not be complacent about the prospects for progress. It takes an enormous amount of constant moral work just to keep us where we are. And one worry I have about optimists like Bregman is that they make human progress seem much too easy. And there's a real danger there.
Okay, so my final question, and then we'll move on to the various questions that have come up in the chat and Q&A function, is even if misanthropy is true, should we broadcast the bad news about humanity? I guess that question was partly inspired by Mary Midgley's trenchant critique of the selfish gene idea as just an extremely bad idea to broadcast to humans, for it may deepen our vices in that case. In this case, it may deepen, for example, our despair, our indifference, our bitterness. What do you make of that kind of question?
Well, I think it'd be crucial to ask two related questions. So one, is a misanthropic verdict true or accurate? And second, is it useful to broadcast? Now, on those two questions, many misanthropes differ. So Montaigne, for instance, I think clearly regards a misanthropic verdict as true, but he thinks it's very, very unwise to broadcast it except to certain select people. So he seems to be of the spirit that you should confess the misanthropic vision to certain people if you have trust that they will understand it in the right ways, react to it in the right ways, but you shouldn't just put it about there in the social world at large because you don't know what the responses will be. There are some misanthropes who take the real hard line. If it's true, you should broadcast it, regardless of the consequences. I occasionally think Schopenhauer falls into that category. For him, if it's true, you broadcast it. But I think the majority of misanthropes that I've studied, they're of the much more circumspect view that even if it is true, you need to be extremely careful about whether you broadcast it, partly for the reasons you give. It could license our viciousness. It could be corrupting. It could give people a get out of jail free card. Well, if you're saying that we're all, lazy, arrogant, vicious, and rapacious, well, I'll join in the awful party that is human beings. And I think that's a case where one has to think about specific misanthropes and their traditions. So I think early Buddhism is highly misanthropic, but I also think that they give very, very good reasons for keeping quiet about this. And they tend to be pragmatic reasons. I mean, for one thing, if people recognize that Buddhism is fundamentally a misanthropic appraisal of human beings, it's going to be very hard to recruit Buddhists. In which case, maybe don't open with the misanthropy, open with meditation, mindfulness, and virtues. And then when people are on board and are psychologically and morally ready, maybe then present them with the truths of misanthropy, because it is a bitter pill to swallow.
Okay, thank you. And so I'm going to open it up to the Q&A. I noticed a few things have come through the chat function, and so I'll let Joanna mediate that and maybe send over any questions to me. So one question that came from Alec Grant says, Ian, would you regard Nietzsche's critiquing of self-deceiving morality in favor of life-affirming morality across his oeuvre as misanthropic?
Nice question. Nietzsche is someone I've vacillated about whether he is a misanthrope. Now, my current tentative verdict is that Nietzsche is a misanthrope, at least relative to his scheme of values. So if you think about his critique of Judeo-Christian morality and his critiques of democracy and equality, he clearly seems to have the sense that a certain range of vices and failings have become entrenched within at least Western European culture. And he also adds the interesting twist that we don't realize just how awful we are because, on his account, the priests have deceived us into thinking that what are virtues are actually vices and vice versa. So I think that he is a misanthrope, and I think he is right to call in question of the idea that we would actually agree on this. Because if his account is right, then we have an extremely well-developed capacity for self-deception, and that includes deception about our moral status. Now, actually, that doesn't come from Nietzsche. He took that from La Rochefoucauld. Rochefoucauld says that what's really awful about us is not that we are morally corrupt, it's that we are very, very good at denying how morally corrupt we are. So people will say, I'm not arrogant, I'm forthright. I'm not lazy, I'm restrained. And then we can tell ourselves these self-serving stories and glossily disguising our vices as virtues. And I think that's what really troubles Nietzsche. It's that we are incapable about being honest about the sorts of creatures we've come to be. And as Nietzsche says in Twilight of the Idols, if you can't be honest with yourself about what you are, then by definition, you cannot be living a good life. And then, of course, for him, the punchline is most people can't bear the sorts of creatures they are. That's why they have to live in this systematic self-deception, because most of us are too, in his terms, too weak and too botched to cope with our own frailties. So he's a very pessimistic misanthrope.
I mean, actually, that links in with another question that's come up from an anonymous attendee, and it asks basically whether misanthropy has to be a kind of fringe or marginal philosophy precisely for the reasons you said, that ultimately, for pragmatic reasons, we tend to prefer positive stories about ourselves and our future. I mean, do you think, I guess the nub of the question is, do you think misanthropy has any crossover potential? I mean, off the top of my head, it seems that anyone who watches a recent David Attenborough documentary immediately becomes a misanthrope of some sort. You know, they watch it and they're horrified and they think humans are absolutely appalling. So there is definitely a strong crossover potential. On the other hand, it does seem, for the reasons you said, that it's unlikely to become a mainstream view about ourselves.
Well, I think there are two issues. So one, I think it's very easy for someone to say that they're a misanthrope, but it's quite a different and more difficult thing to actually be one. So I can imagine some people who think there's something attractive and radical and provocative about being a misanthrope, but they haven't really fully internalized that vision of things. Because this is the point that the Buddha makes. You know, he says, you haven't really understood the Four Noble Truths unless you've been transformed in the way that you think and feel and respond to the world. And it's crucial for me that misanthropy is not a paper doctrine, you know, one that you hold on paper, but that doesn't transform your world. As you really internalize a misanthropic vision, it does change the way that you think and feel. So I'd worry that there are many people who might say, oh yeah, you know, I heard kids talk, I'm a misanthrope now. That was easy. It's quite different. It's a transformation of your vision of the world and of yourself. But second, I think there are probably good reasons why misanthropy would never become a widespread doctrine. I mean, one is, of course, it's a very depressing vision of human life. It requires you to transform your attitudes, your aspirations, your moral expectations. It could have invidious psychological effects upon people.
Unless you're an activist misanthrope, which doesn't seem to have those constraints.
The activist stance might be the more bearable one. And it might be the case that you could have a relatively widespread misanthropy under certain cultural conditions. So I'm a great believer in the fact that our philosophical ideas are not merely shaped by our internal reflections, but by the wider state of the world. For instance, you know, I think it was not surprising that the doctrine of original sins really started to become rooted in Europe during the appalling times of, for instance, the Black Death. Because if people start to see the truths of philosophical doctrines reflected in the state of the world, then I think they can start to become misanthropes. And I think that's why it's quite telling that the most popular strains of misanthropy tend to be found in environmental writings. There are many, many eco-misanthropes, because if you look at our appalling treatment of animals in the natural environment, then you start to reflect upon the wastefulness and the violence built into our existence. Then you start to move towards misanthropy. So to become a misanthrope, you have to internalize the doctrine, but then have the confirmation of the state of the world seen clearly and honestly.
Okay, super. So there's a few more questions. Could I request that anyone else who wants a question asked, post it through the Q&A bit rather than the chat bit, because the chat bit's become a little bit unwieldy and I can't concentrate on Ian and look at it at the same time, and keep it fairly short. So another question, which I guess links back to David Cooper's book. It says, can you say that David Cooper's thoughts about the treatment of animals is similar to Peter Singer's in the context of misanthropy? So I guess it's about the ways in which the two approaches of Cooper and Singer may dovetail with each other or become very different analyses.
Yes, I think there is, David and Singer, they both agree, I think, on a broad kind of eco-misanthropy, that our treatment of animals and nature is appalling. However, there's a crucial difference between them. David criticizes Singer and other mainstream animal ethicists because he thinks that their moral frameworks really tend to let us off the hook. So for utilitarians, consequentialists, animal rights theorists, they give a very narrow appraisal of the wrongs of our treatment of animals. They'll either focus upon the bad effects on them, or they'll focus on our violation of moral rights. But for David, this is too thin, because any genuine analysis of the moral wrongs of our treatment of animals has to involve our vices and failings, our arrogance, mindlessness, cruelty, malevolence, selfishness, vanity, and greed. But those are the sorts of features that tend to get left out of analyses like Singer's. I mean, he will mention, for instance, the violence that generates the bad consequences, but not all the other vices and failings. And also, folks like Singer tend to give quite rational analyses of why we treat animals so appallingly. So very crudely, we've simply failed to recognize that they have moral status. And over time, as we start to realize the moral status, we will include them within this expanding circle of moral concern. But the problem is that that paints our moral failings as basically rational failings. We just haven't quite logically grasped that animals have the same moral status we apply to other creatures, that they can suffer, so we should care for them. But I take it that many people would much rather confess to failings of logic than to failures of character. And the problem with stories like Singer's is that they leave out many of the vices and failings that should worry us, but also they treat our failings as basically intellectual or rational failings, not moral failings. The problem is not that we are failing to be consistent, it's that we're being cruel. And cruelty is a much worse charge than inconsistency. So there's that important difference between them. I think for David, Singer's account is much too narrow, and in certain ways flatters us by saying, well, we're not essentially vicious and cruel, we just haven't properly thought about what moral status means.
Okay, thanks. So this question is from Aurora Arellano. I hope I've pronounced that right. So she asks, what do you think about the implications between misanthropy, misogyny, and dehumanization? And I suppose she's asking about the interconnections or not. Because I suppose misogyny is a kind of slightly more focused form of misanthropy. And then she also asks about dehumanization. So what do you have to say about the relations between those three terms?
Thanks, Aurora. Very nice question. That's something I'm thinking about now, but the current thought I have is that there are many different ways into misanthropy. So for Cooper, it was reflection on our treatment of animals. And I think for many feminists, it's the appalling systemic marginalization of women and other groups. So on my thinking then, misogyny is a particular dimension of a wider misanthropic appraisal of human beings. Different critics will want to emphasize different aspects of our awfulness, whether it's the way that we treat animals or nature or women or other marginal groups, but it would be a component in a wider misanthropic appraisal. And one thing you see over history is that misanthropes focus on different things. So for many medieval Christians, the moral failings that really worried people were spiritual failings like impiety and lack of faith and so on. Whereas for many contemporary early 21st century feminist social theorists, it will be structural patriarchy. So I think misogyny would be an important dimension of a wider misanthropic appraisal. But misanthropy is, if you like, the fundamental category that includes all the rest. So the doctrine of misanthropy I would develop would include our appalling treatment of animals and of women. It would include structural inequalities. It would include a whole range of other failings, but it's a specific way in to misanthropy.
Okay, so there's another question from someone who's remained anonymous, and it says, can having a misanthropic mindset in the midst of social alienation or continued isolation within society induce a kind of nihilistic form of thinking within an individual? So I guess it's about the dangers of internalizing a misanthropic worldview in the absence of sufficient friendship, to give your example of Montaigne, or social support. It seems to me to be a question about the danger of such a worldview in the absence of adequate social support or a feeling of involvement in society.
I think Anonymous is right that there is a strong risk that if you internalize this misanthropic vision too quickly and without the right sorts of social and emotional support, it could have quite baleful effects upon people. So it's interesting to me that many historical misanthropes have always been members of communities, usually very small and intimate communities, but they've not tried to practice their misanthropy alone. And I think one of the reasons is that people recognize that without friendship and collegiality and support, they would find it difficult to bear emotionally the costs of misanthropy. And I take it nihilism would be one of those risks. Now, there'd be some careful work to do to try to reconcile misanthropy and nihilism, because in certain respects, a misanthrope is not a nihilist. So in order to engage in moral condemnation of humankind, you have to have strong moral commitments. For instance, you can't lament human vices and failings without some commitment to human excellences and virtues. So the misanthrope is always morally engaged. But I can imagine very sad cases where a misanthrope struggles for so long with a bleak vision of humankind without any compensation that they do fall into a sort of nihilism. And I think this is what Judith Splar worries when she says that misanthropy can make us miserable and friendless. That over time, unless you have some compensations like friendship or religious faith or something like that, then misanthropy can become extraordinarily corrosive. And I can think of some rather nihilistic misanthropic writers, like Emil Kieran, for instance, I think falls into that group. But that's a case where it's best to develop and practice misanthropy within small communities of fellow misanthropes who presumably gather together for fairly glum parties and then try to find ways to cope with things.
Yeah, I guess Slipknot fans are a collective of misanthrope nihilists, or at least that's how they're often presented. So this is a question from Peter Tooth, and he asks, do you think that the greater part of so-called philosophical misanthropy derives from two intellectual forces, A, religious / Christian doctrine, and B, 19th century romanticism coming up against industrial capitalism? So I guess he's asking about the sources of misanthropy.
Hi, Peter. I imagine that they would play a very important role in explaining certain forms of misanthropy, at least within the West. So, I think that the Christian doctrine of original sin did a lot of important work in helping to make salient certain forms of misanthropy. But I think in other times and other cultures, you get very different drivers of misanthropy. So a case I'm working on at the moment is classical Chinese philosophy, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and so on. Now, they seem to have been misanthropic really from the get-go, from at least the 5th century BC onwards. But their misanthropy was driven by quite different concerns, ones that we wouldn't necessarily characterize as religious in any familiar sense. Ditto the Buddhists. Of course, there are questions about the religious character of Buddhism, but they seem to have been misanthropic from the beginning, but for reasons independently of, for instance, our relationship with God or industrial and social developments. So what you see, I think, are very, very different forms of misanthropy being animated by different types of consideration. So a lot of modern eco-misanthropes, of course, they will point to industrial capitalism as one of the main forces supercharging our failings. Other people point to different developments. And that's why I think we really need to tell quite detailed histories of different forms of misanthropy, because there are at least 4 different stances, there are different ways to be a misanthrope, and different stories to tell about how we came to be this way.
So this is a question from Lisa Whiting, who I believe you may have taught back at Durham. She mentioned in a recent email exchange that she taught you. She asked, where do misanthropes position themselves within their worldview? Are they equally part of the negativity and pessimism that they see in others?
Interesting question, Lisa. I think actually many misanthropes struggle to reconcile their misanthropy with their wider convictions. I mean, there's always going to be a tension between your misanthropic vision of humankind and your moral, social, political convictions. A good example is Buddhism. So in early Buddhism, I think there's a very strong misanthropy, strong condemnation of human existence as, in the Buddha's words, burning with violence, hate, greed, and delusion. And a tricky question for the early Buddhists, including the Buddha himself, is how we should act in response to this. So many of the Buddha's early disciples says, well, maybe we should engage in forms of political activism. Maybe we should go out there and consult with rulers and try to change society from the top down. But the Buddha warns against this. His famous advice, keep to your own preserves, attend to your own moral character, don't get involved, but still feels the pull to try to persuade rulers to get social and political. Other misanthropes seem very willing to just swallow their misanthropy and abandon their other philosophical commitments, to let go of certain hopes and to adopt those quieter ways of living. And I think for many misanthropes, there's a real struggle, partly because misanthropes often tend not to theorize their misanthropy in certain ways. So if you read a lot of the Buddhism scholarship these days, you wouldn't even know there's a strong misanthropic core. People don't mention it. And that's not giving people the sorts of reflective resources they need to cope with their misanthropy. People sort of suppress it and push it down into the background. But that makes it difficult for people to make decisions about how optimistic or pessimistic or positive or negative to be. And that's why I worry about people like Bregman for encouraging unduly optimistic accounts of our moral possibilities. I think it's important for a misanthrope to be honest about their misanthropy, get it out there into the open so they can ask difficult questions like, how does this affect our other doctrines? How does this affect the other practices that we engage in? And that's tricky when people understandably don't want to be upfront about their misanthropy. So I think for many misanthropes, that's part of the misanthropic predicament. It's coping with their misanthropy within communities of practice and belief that are resistant to being open about that misanthropy.
Okay, so we'll probably only have time for one last question. So I really apologize to the various people whose questions haven't been answered. So this question, again, from an anonymous person who's obviously read the Rutger Bregman book. They pick up on the fact that he dismisses things like misanthropy and pessimism as clinical symptoms. And they also pick up that elsewhere, thinkers like Steven Pinker have referred to certain pessimistic thinkers in clinical terms like psychopaths or sociopaths. So the question is, what do you think about this tendency to psychologize or pathologize the misanthrope or the pessimist, which I think is probably more the case in Bregman's book?
Yeah, that was one of the more disappointing features of Bregman's book. He describes cynicism, pessimism, and misanthropy as, I think you quoted, clinical symptoms of a mean world syndrome. All sorts of problems with this, not least the casual use of pathologization to try to dismiss doctrines. And also, it's very strange for Bregman to describe pessimism and cynicism as clinical symptoms of a pathology, because elsewhere in the book, he's very open about his socialist credentials. And I take it that it's very strange for a socialist to suggest that having a pessimistic vision of the world is a symptom of a clinical depression. I mean, I take it that, for instance, becoming a feminist and becoming initiated into the realities of patriarchy makes you kind of pessimistic and cynical. And members of many oppressed groups, their day-to-day experience of the world gives them a pessimistic, cynical stance on human beings and human societies, but one that you should honor and respect as a disclosure of important facts about the world, not try to dismiss in this pathologizing way. So I think it's understandable that you'd try to dismiss misanthropy by pathologizing it and attributing it to a depressive mindset or a gloomy temperament. But it's, first of all, lazy. Second, insulting to those who do actually have genuine psychiatric problems, but also ignores the fact that you could come to having a misanthropic, pessimistic vision of the world through experience and reflection. In fact, this is exactly Kant's point about misanthropy. He says one of the frustrating things is misanthropy is often taught to us through long, sad experience of the realities of living within the human world. And it's appalling, I think, to try to just dismiss in this cavalier way people's painful experience of what the world is like. So that's a very weak way to dismiss misanthropy, by treating it as symptomatic of some psychiatric disorder or delusion that can be lazily dismissed. And again, if people want to be genuinely serious about reform of the social world, whether it's socialist or not, you should really start by listening to those people who have painful experience of the realities of that world you're trying to change, rather than just dismissing them as pathological, sociopathic, or hysterical.
Thank you, Ian. Do you have any brief final words before we wrap this up and hand over to Joanna to announce any further bits and bobs?
Well, otherwise, aside from thanking folks for their questions tonight, I'm currently working on my book on misanthropy, so it's extremely valuable seeing people's questions and also what people are interested in. I have posted in the chat a link to an article I recently wrote about misanthropy, and there's also, if you're free of time, a video of me talking about this. So if you want to know more, please do. And I would also recommend David Cooper's book, Animals and Misanthropy. That was the book that got me started. And it's very short and very readable, but makes a compelling case for philosophical misanthropy. And if folks are interested to know more, and if they want to ask any other questions about misanthropy, very welcome to email me. I'm strangely happy to talk about misanthropy.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ian. Really great to chat with you. And I guess we'll hand over to Joanna for any final words.